Millionaire invites his ex-wife to his wedding to humiliate her, but she shows up with his look-alike, James Whitmore's invitation. James Whitmore had spent years building an empire, from a struggling architect to a real estate magnate worth over $300 million. Now, with the world at his feet and a glamorous fiancée in Victoria Prescott, he was on the brink of something monumental, his wedding to the woman who would solidify his place in New York's elite circles. But one thing gnawed at him: his ex-wife, Olivia Bennett, who had walked away from him 12 years ago. James knew that the wedding wouldn't be complete without sending Olivia an invitation. It wasn't about reconciliation or wanting her back. It was about showing her just how far he had come. After all, she had left him when he was a struggling architect, consumed by his ambitions, and now he was on top, with more money and success than he had ever dreamed of. Olivia had made a choice to leave him, and he had made his own choice to move on. The invitation he decided to send was lavish, gold-embossed, a reflection of his newfound status. His assistant hesitated when he asked for Olivia's name to be added to the guest list, but James insisted, his tone cold and deliberate. "Make sure she gets the premium invitation," he instructed. This wedding, he told himself, was his triumph, and Olivia was going to witness it. The satisfaction of having her attend was about more than just showing her success. It was about proving that he was right to focus on his career and wealth, something she had never understood. James took one last look at his wedding guest list. As he sat in his corner office overlooking Manhattan's skyline, he smiled, thinking about how Victoria would be by his side. She was everything he had ever wanted in a partner: beautiful, social, and poised. Together, they would be the power couple of New York. But deep down, he knew there was a lingering question that remained unanswered. Would Olivia regret leaving him? Meanwhile, Olivia was in a modest apartment grading papers. The phone call about the invitation had come late, and she had briefly considered throwing it out. After all, what was the point? James had never been in touch for years. But then, there was Ethan, their son, who had just made starting pitcher on his baseball team. The boy's excitement was infectious, and in that moment, Olivia couldn't ignore the urge to give him a chance to meet his father, even if it had been a long time coming. The thick cream envelope sat on the kitchen counter for a while before Ethan found it. He was curious, but Olivia tried to brush it off. When he asked about James, Olivia hesitated, the weight of the past bearing down on her. She had never told him about his father, not out of malice, but because James had been distant. Their last conversation, filled with bitterness, had made it impossible for her to reach out. She had moved on, or so she thought. Now the invitation to the wedding and Ethan's questions were stirring up memories she had long buried. The past was coming back, and there was no way to avoid it. When Ethan found the invitation and learned who James was, Olivia decided it was time for the truth to come out. She sat down and explained the past to her son, trying to piece together the fragmented history of a broken family. Her decision not to tell James about Ethan had seemed like the right one at the time, but now, looking at her son, she wasn't so sure. He deserved to know his father, even if it was going to be uncomfortable for everyone. Olivia knew that going to the wedding would be difficult. She didn't want to disrupt James's big day, but Ethan was insistent. "I have a right to meet him," he said. Those words struck Olivia like a blow to the chest. What was she really protecting? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about her. It was about Ethan and his right to know his father. The next morning, as Olivia sorted through her papers, her phone rang. It was Victoria Prescott, the woman James was about to marry. Olivia's heart sank when she heard Victoria's voice, sweet yet laced with a subtle edge of tension. "I've known about Ethan for quite some time," Victoria confessed. The admission caught Olivia off guard. Victoria then revealed that James still had no idea about their son. The conversation ended abruptly, with Victoria's invitation for Olivia and Ethan to attend the wedding. This new information, Olivia's unexpected response. As the days passed, Olivia found herself grappling with a complex set of emotions. She had never anticipated a situation like this. What started as a simple desire to raise her son independently had turned into a whirlwind that forced her to confront her past with James. The invitation had cracked open a door she thought was closed forever. When Olivia received the phone call from Victoria, she was taken aback. She hadn't expected anyone to acknowledge the existence of Ethan, let alone Victoria, who had apparently known all along. Victoria had claimed that she had been touched by Olivia's story about single motherhood. But Olivia could hear the underlying possessiveness in Victoria's voice, as if Ethan's existence was an inconvenient truth that could potentially unravel everything James had worked for. Victoria had told Olivia she was looking forward to seeing them both at the wedding, an invitation laced with thinly veiled tension. It was clear that Victoria wanted to maintain control over the situation, and Olivia, feeling the sting of years of silence, wasn't about to let her dictate the terms. Olivia didn't want to be dragged into a petty drama at James's wedding, but for Ethan's sake, she knew it was time to face the truth. That evening, as she sat with Ethan at the kitchen table, trying to help him with his homework, Olivia realized that the invitation was more than just a piece of paper. It was an opportunity for Ethan. For the first time in 12 years, her son had a chance to meet his father. Whether or not they were ready to face each other, Olivia knew this moment was inevitable. Ethan had a right to know the truth, no matter how complicated it might be. Ethan had been asking more questions about James, about why he had never been in his life. Olivia tried to shield him from the pain, but the reality was unavoidable. "Why didn't you ever tell him about me?" Ethan asked quietly one evening as they sat together. Olivia felt the familiar pang of guilt that had haunted her for years. She had tried to explain to him that it wasn't because she didn't want James to be a part of his life, but because James had made it clear that his career was his priority, not family. Ethan, with his big blue eyes, had only ever wanted the truth. "I didn't know how to tell him," Olivia explained, the words catching in her throat. "He was too far away, and by the time I found out I was pregnant, he had already changed. I couldn't reach him. And then, as the years went by, it just became harder and harder." Ethan had looked at her with the kind of maturity that made Olivia wonder if he was the one who had been shielding her, instead of the other way around. "Do you think he'll be mad?" he asked, his voice small but full of longing. It was the first time Olivia realized how much her son had hoped for a connection with his father, even if he had never said it aloud. The invitation became a catalyst. Despite all the pain and confusion it stirred, it was also the moment Olivia realized that Ethan deserved to meet the man who, whether he liked it or not, was his father. It wasn't about forgiving James. It wasn't even about them getting back together. It was about Ethan having the opportunity to know the man who had been absent for so much of his life. The following day, Olivia made the decision. She would take Ethan to the wedding, no matter how difficult it would be. There was no turning back now. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her chest, but she knew it was the right thing to do. Ethan had a right to meet his father, and it was time to stop hiding the truth. As she looked at the invitation once more, the gold lettering seemed to mock her. But this time, instead of feeling resentful or bitter, Olivia was ready. She would show James the son he had never known, and in doing so, she hoped that perhaps he would finally see what he had missed. The day of the rehearsal dinner arrived. Olivia stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the black dress she had chosen simple, understated, and elegant. She wasn't trying to make a statement, but she wasn't going to shrink away either. Her mind was focused on Ethan, who, despite his excitement, was nervous about meeting his father. Olivia tried to reassure him, but she couldn't deny the knots in her stomach. James had no idea what was about to hit him. She could already imagine the look on his face when he saw Ethan standing there, so much like him. The resemblance would be undeniable. The child he had abandoned, now standing at the threshold of his new life. As Olivia and Ethan walked into the ballroom, the whispers started. The guests parted, and for a moment everything seemed to freeze. The realization hit James like a thunderclap. The boy standing beside Olivia was his son. His eyes widened in disbelief, his body frozen in shock. The resemblance was uncanny, everything from the blonde hair to the strong jawline and blue eyes. "Is that my son?" James's voice was barely a whisper, but it was loud enough for the entire room to hear. The guests turned their attention toward the newcomer, curiosity etched across their faces. Olivia, standing tall beside Ethan, met James's gaze and answered simply, "Yes, James. This is Ethan, your son." The weight of those words settled over James like a heavy burden. He felt a wave of guilt and disbelief wash over him. The wedding invitation. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel gleamed with opulence, its crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light over tables adorned with white orchids and gold-rimmed china. James Whitmore stood near the entrance, greeting guests with Victoria at his side, a picture of grace and beauty. This wedding was meant to cement their place in Manhattan's elite society. Everything was meticulously planned: the venue, the guests, the press coverage, all intended to showcase his success. His empire was finally complete, and he was marrying the woman who had everything he thought he needed. But as James surveyed the room with satisfaction, he knew there was one final touch needed to make this evening perfect. The satisfaction of having Olivia Bennet, his ex-wife, there to witness it. 12 years had passed since their divorce, and in that time, James had transformed from a struggling architect into a powerful real estate mogul. Victoria's presence beside him only made the success feel sweeter. Yet deep down, a part of him still wondered about Olivia. He had built his empire for himself, but the thought of her, of the life they had shared before everything became about money and ambition, lingered in the back of his mind. He couldn't help but want her to see this, see what she had walked away from. When James had sent Olivia the gold-embossed wedding invitation, he didn't expect a response. He just wanted her to be there to witness what he had accomplished. But when his assistant had questioned him about including her on the guest list, his tone had been firm. "Make sure she gets the premium invitation," James had ordered. Olivia wasn't a woman who typically attended events like this, but James was determined. He had everything to prove, and if Olivia showed up, it would be his moment of victory. But he had underestimated the impact of her presence. It wasn't just her being there that shocked him, it was the arrival of her son. James hadn't prepared for this moment. He thought he could control the narrative, but the sight of Ethan standing beside Olivia, the boy with striking blue eyes and the same features as him, stopped him dead in his tracks. The boy was unmistakably his. The murmur in the room quieted as James's eyes locked onto Ethan S. Olivia's words, "This is Ethan, your son," hung in the air. For a moment, everything felt suspended. The room seemed to close in around James, and he could feel his pulse quickening as he processed the reality that had been thrust upon him. The boy standing before him was his flesh and blood, someone he had unknowingly abandoned, a part of his life that he had never lived. Olivia, who had once been his partner, now stood before him with a calm confidence that James hadn't expected. She wasn't there to make a scene. She was there because, despite everything, she had wanted Ethan to meet his father. But James, caught off guard, was filled with a mix of disbelief, confusion, and anger. "Is this some kind of joke?" James blurted, his voice tight with frustration. He wanted to lash out, to ask her why she had kept this from him for so long, but the look on Olivia's face, the calm certainty with which she stood, made him second-guess his emotions. He wasn't prepared for this moment. He had expected a moment of triumph, but now he was confronted with the harsh reality of his own mistakes. "I have his birth certificate in my purse," Olivia replied, her voice measured and calm. "And a DNA test result. I anticipated your skepticism." James's mind raced as he looked at Ethan. The resemblance was undeniable. It was as if a mirror had been placed in front of him, showing him the life he had missed. He saw his own features reflected back in the boy's face. The same blonde hair, the same jawline, the same piercing blue eyes. Ethan was his son, and James couldn't deny it any longer. The weight of this revelation hit James harder than anything he had experienced in years. For so long, he had convinced himself that success, wealth, and status were the only things that mattered. But here, in this moment, he was forced to confront the consequences of his choices. His ambition had blinded him to the most important thing in his life, his family. Ethan, standing beside Olivia, was clearly uncomfortable. The boy's blue eyes, so much like James's, flickered with uncertainty, yet there was also a hint of defiance. Despite being thrust into a situation he couldn't have understood fully, Ethan stood tall, his shoulders squared, meeting James's gaze with a quiet intensity that made James feel even more unsettled. "I wanted to meet you," Ethan said, his voice not quite a boy's but not yet a man's. It was a simple statement, but it carried a weight that James hadn't anticipated. For the first time in a long time, he was faced with something real, something that mattered more than any business deal, more than any building he had constructed. James felt a mixture of guilt, anger, and confusion swirl inside him. The child he had never known was standing in front of him, and he had no idea how to react. "You should go," James finally muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. "We received an invitation," James, Olivia replied coolly. "We're staying for dinner." The tension in the air was palpable as Olivia and Ethan walked away, leaving James to process the moment. Victoria, ever the social strategist, appeared by his side, her smile fixed but brittle. "What a surprise," she said, her voice strained with a mix of annoyance and forced cheer. "I didn't know James had a son." "Apparently neither did I," James muttered under his breath. Olivia and Ethan were seated at a distant table, far from the head table where James sat with Victoria. The whispers in the room were inevitable. Guests exchanged looks, trying to understand the dynamic that had unfolded. James, meanwhile, tried to push through his emotions, but his mind kept returning to the boy, to Ethan. As the dinner progressed, the conversation felt like Ethan's questions. As the evening wore on, James felt increasingly disconnected from the world around him. The lavish dinner, the well-dressed guests, and the perfectly executed event felt like they were happening to someone else. He couldn't stop thinking about Ethan, the boy who was supposed to be part of his life, the boy he had never known. How had he missed out on so much? How had he let time slip away without knowing the child who shared his features, his blood? Later that evening, James found himself standing alone at the bar, nursing a drink, trying to shake off the cloud of uncertainty that had settled over him. His best friend and business partner, Marcus, walked over, concern evident in his eyes. "Quite the development," Marcus remarked, raising an eyebrow. "Kid looks exactly like you." James was barely paying attention. "She should have told me," he muttered, more to himself than to Marcus. "I never had a chance to know him." Marcus, ever the realist, handed him a drink. Probably he agreed. "But from what I remember, you weren't exactly receptive to communication back then." James shot him a glance, and Marcus held up his hands in mock surrender. "What I mean is, you didn't exactly make it easy for her to reach you. You were always working, always focused on building your empire." The words stung. James knew they were true. He had been so focused on his career that he had neglected everything else, including his family. His obsession with success had cost him more than he had ever realized. And now, here was Ethan, a living reminder of everything he had lost. James's thoughts were interrupted by the sight of Ethan walking toward the restrooms. Without thinking, he followed the boy, needing to speak to him to figure out what this all meant. He found Ethan standing at the sink in the marble-lined bathroom, looking as out of place in this environment as James felt. The boy was fidgeting with his tie, his face scrunched up in thought. James hesitated before speaking. "You like baseball?" he asked, trying to start a conversation. Ethan looked up, surprised but pleased. "I do," Ethan replied, his voice still carrying the excitement of his recent achievement as starting pitcher. "I play for the school team." "I played baseball too," James said, his voice softening as he realized how much he had in common with this boy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a picture of himself from his high school days in a baseball uniform. "You ever think about playing professionally?" Ethan's eyes lit up, and for a moment the tension between them seemed to dissipate. "Maybe," he said, his voice full of cautious excitement, "but right now I just love the game." James smiled, feeling a flicker of connection with his son, something he hadn't experienced before. "I'll show you some of my old baseball stuff sometime," he promised, trying to make up for lost years. But as they stood there, an awkward silence settled between them. James didn't know how to bridge the gap that had formed between them all these years. What did he say to a boy he had missed out on raising? What could he offer after all this time? Before he could dwell on it further, Ethan spoke again, his voice small but sincere. "My mom says you used to design buildings," he said, his eyes flicking toward the mirror. "Is that true?" James felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the boy to be so inquisitive, so eager to know about him. It was a bittersweet moment, realizing that all the time he had spent building a legacy, a career, hadn't prepared him for the simple but profound question of how to connect with his son. "I used to design buildings," James answered, his voice steady but his mind racing. "Now I mostly buy and sell them. But I used to love creating things that lasted, you know." Ethan nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "My mom says you're really good at it." James smiled at the compliment, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been a failure in the most important part of his life. "Maybe someday you and I can build something together," he suggested. "Start small, you know, maybe a treehouse or something." Ethan's eyes widened. "Really? You mean like, together?" "Yeah," James said, surprised at how natural the idea seemed. "We could build something just for you. We could start with your dream house." For a moment, the weight of the years seemed to lighten. Ethan's enthusiasm was palpable, and James couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something. Maybe, despite all the lost time, they could still build a relationship. As they walked back to the ballroom, James felt a shift in his perspective. The wedding, the lavish ceremony, the grand plans, none of it mattered. What mattered was Ethan, and what mattered now was trying to make up for the time he had lost. It wasn't about the wedding anymore. It was about trying to be a father. When James returned to the ballroom, Victoria was waiting for him. Her face was tense, her smile forced. "What did you say to the boy?" she asked, her voice clipped. James looked at her, his mind made up. "His name is Ethan," he replied, his voice calm but resolute, "and he's my son." Victoria's face faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. "This wedding is still happening on Saturday," she said firmly, trying to maintain control. James, however, was no longer so sure. He looked past her at Olivia and Ethan, watching them with a quiet smile, and the doubt in his mind grew stronger. He wasn't sure about this wedding, about his life with Victoria. For the first time in years, he questioned everything he thought he wanted. The confrontation. The day following the rehearsal dinner, James woke up with a sense of unease. The events from the night before, the unexpected arrival of Olivia and Ethan, the harsh reality of meeting his son for the first time, weighed heavily on him. The questions swirling in his mind were impossible to silence. How had he missed 12 years of his son's life? What did this mean for his future, for his marriage, for the empire he had so carefully built? Victoria had noticed his distraction throughout the dinner. She had even tried to steer the conversation back to the wedding, but James couldn't focus on anything other than the boy who looked so much like him, the boy who had been absent from his life for far too long. James tried to bury his doubts, but they gnawed at him, especially as he sat in his penthouse later that evening, alone with his thoughts. Victoria, as always, was focused on the wedding details. She seemed oblivious to the emotional storm that was raging inside James. But this time, he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. He needed answers. As the night wore on, James couldn't shake the thought of confronting Olivia, of trying to understand why she hadn't told him about Ethan sooner. Sure, he had his reasons for not being present in their lives, but he couldn't ignore the fact that she had made a choice, too, a choice that had kept him away from his son all these years. The phone rang. It was Olivia. Her voice was calm but firm as she greeted him. "James, we need to talk." "I know," James replied, his voice tight. "Meet me at the plaza." Within the hour, James found himself in a small, private lounge at the Plaza Hotel, waiting for Olivia. The room was silent, the golden lights from the chandeliers casting a warm glow over the walls. It felt like a world apart from the one he had inhabited for the last few years, the world of deals, power lunches, and endless meetings. Now he was standing at a precipice, his carefully constructed life about to be upended by the one thing he had ignored for too long. His family. Olivia arrived, her posture as composed as ever. She wore a simple black dress that didn't try to impress anyone, just like the woman he remembered from the past, focused, determined, yet somehow softer now. There were lines of experience on her face, a reflection of the years she had spent raising Ethan on her own, of the battles she had fought alone. But her eyes, still a piercing blue, met his with the same intensity she had always carried. "You didn't tell me about Ethan," James said before she could even sit down. "Why?" Olivia took a deep breath, the question clearly not one she had expected to be asked. She had hoped for some resolution between them, some understanding, but the truth was always difficult to face, no matter how much time had passed. "I didn't tell you because I didn't think you would care," she replied, her voice steady but edged with a hint of sadness. "I tried to reach you, James, but you were always too busy. You always had something more important to do. After the divorce, I didn't know how to tell you, and by then I was scared. I didn't know if you'd even want to know." James stood still, the words hitting him like a ton of bricks. She was right, of course. He had been consumed with building his empire, with climbing the ladder of success, and had abandoned everything else in the process. And now, standing before her, he saw how much damage that had caused. Ethan wasn't just a symbol of his failure. He was a reminder of everything James had lost in the pursuit of wealth. "I didn't know how to reach you," Olivia continued, her voice a little softer now. "You were gone, James. Physically, emotionally, you were already miles away from me. And after a while, I realized you were never going to be the man I needed you to be. So I raised him on my own, and he turned out just fine." The words stung, and James could feel the truth of them settle deep within him. Olivia wasn't angry, at least not in the way he expected. She wasn't seeking revenge or trying to tear him down. She had simply moved on, built a life without him, and had given Ethan everything he needed. And now, James was realizing just how much he had missed. "I don't expect forgiveness," Olivia said, her eyes locking with his. "But I did what I thought was best for Ethan, and I did it alone." James felt his chest tighten as he fought to maintain control. The reality of his choices, of his selfishness, was sinking in, and for the first time he realized the full extent of his mistakes. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "I was so focused on the future, on building this empire, that I didn't see what really mattered. I didn't see you or Ethan. I didn't see any of it." The silence that followed was thick with emotion, with unspoken truths that neither of them had ever acknowledged before. Olivia didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at him, as though weighing whether or not he truly understood what she was saying. "I don't know what to do now," James admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't just go back to the way things were. But I want to be a part of Ethan's life. I want to make up for the time I've lost." Olivia took a deep breath, then nodded. "We can't undo the past, James, but we can try to move forward for Ethan's sake." For the first time in a long while, James felt a sense of clarity. It wasn't about fixing the past or trying to turn back time. It was about moving forward, about building something real, something he hadn't known he needed until now. As they left the private lounge, James felt like he had taken the first step toward healing. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and there was no guarantee that everything would work out perfectly, but for the first time in years, he felt like he had a chance to make things right. Victoria's reaction. The next morning, after his conversation with Olivia, James couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he wasn't fully prepared for. The night before had been a turning point, but he still had one looming issue to face: Victoria. He had spent years building his relationship with her, an image of perfection crafted in the midst of his ambition, and now he was beginning to wonder if that relationship was built on shaky ground. Victoria had been everything he thought he needed: beautiful, ambitious, and connected. Together, they made the perfect couple on the outside. But James was realizing that the more time he spent with Olivia and Ethan, the more he began questioning everything he had chosen to pursue. Could he really go through with this wedding, knowing that his life, his future, had taken a different direction than he had originally intended? Victoria had been agitated the entire night, her gaze lingering on him as if she sensed something was wrong. Despite the stress of the wedding preparations, she made sure to keep up appearances, maintaining a tight grip on their plans. But as James sat down to breakfast with her the next morning, he knew things could never go back to the way they had been. "James, we need to talk," Victoria said, her tone cold as she placed her fork down. "You've been distracted all night. What's going on? Is it because of your ex-wife and that child?" Her voice trembled with an unmistakable mix of anger and hurt. She could tell that something had shifted in him, and it was more than just the shock of seeing Olivia again. James looked up at her, his stomach twisting. He knew this moment was inevitable, but he still wasn't ready for it. He wanted to tell her the truth, to explain how everything had suddenly come into focus, how meeting Ethan had opened his eyes to what he had missed, but he couldn't find the right words. Instead, he settled on the truth, even though it wasn't easy to say. "Victoria, I can't do this," James said quietly, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "I can't marry you." The words hit Victoria like a slap to the face. She blinked, staring at him in disbelief. "What do you mean you can't marry me? We've been planning this for months, James. We're about to be married in 2 days." Her voice rose with a mixture of anger and panic. She had been looking forward to this moment for so long, and now just like that, everything was slipping away. "I can't go through with it," James repeated, his voice firm now. "I've been living my life focused on the wrong things. I've been so obsessed with success, with building an empire, that I lost sight of what really matters." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "This is about your ex-wife, isn't it? You've been talking to her, seeing her again. I knew it. I knew this would happen." Her tone was harsh, and James could see the hurt in her eyes, a hurt she wasn't willing to hide. "You're choosing her over me, over everything we've worked for?" "It's not about choosing her," James said, his voice softer now. "It's about choosing my son, choosing my family. I've missed so much time with him, Victoria. I can't ignore that anymore." Victoria's face flushed with anger. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I've been nothing but supportive of you, James," she snapped, her voice trembling with rage. "And now, just days before our wedding, you're telling me you're canceling it for some professor and her child." James stared at her, his heart heavy with regret. He hadn't meant to hurt her, but he couldn't deny the truth any longer. "I can't go through with it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but her pride wouldn't let her break down in front of him. She turned away, walking toward the door. "You'll regret this, James. You'll see." Her voice cracked as she spoke, but she didn't look back. She didn't want to see him anymore, not like this. James sat in the empty room, feeling the weight of the decision settle over him. He had just ended his engagement, the culmination of years of building a life he thought he wanted. But now all of it felt meaningless compared to the reality of his son. He had chosen to face the past, to reconnect with Ethan, and in doing so, he had lost everything else. The silence in the room was suffocating, and for the first time in a long while, James allowed himself to feel the weight of his choices. He had walked away from everything he thought mattered, the power, the wealth, the connections, and he was left with nothing but the uncertainty of what came next. Victoria's words echoed in his mind, but James knew, deep down, that he had made the right choice. He couldn't go back to a life where he ignored his son. He couldn't continue down the path of success at the expense of the one thing that truly mattered. In the days that followed, James continued to wrestle with the consequences of his actions. Victoria had left, taking with her the dream of a perfect life that he had spent years constructing. His business was teetering on the edge, the fallout from the canceled wedding creating waves in his professional life. But as he spent more time with Ethan, he began to realize that none of it mattered. None of the wealth, the fame, or the status mattered if it meant missing out on his son's life. For the first time, James found peace in the uncertainty, in the chaos that came with stepping away from the life he had built. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he was no longer afraid of what was to come. Ethan and James bonding. As the days after the wedding passed, the tension from James's break with Victoria still hung in the air, but he found a surprising sense of calm in his newfound role as a father. The empire he had built for himself seemed to pale in comparison to the excitement and uncertainty that came with reconnecting with Ethan. It wasn't just about being a parent again. It was about discovering who he could be outside the realm of business, beyond the contracts, the meetings, and the endless drive for success. He found himself craving a different kind of connection, one he hadn't experienced in over a decade. James had always believed that success was defined by the big projects, the skyscrapers, the financial growth. But now, in Ethan's presence, he felt something more profound. The potential to build something lasting, not just in terms of real estate, but in terms of relationships. He had missed out on his son's entire life, his baseball games, his school events, his childhood milestones, and now he was determined to make up for it. The question was, how? One Saturday, James invited Ethan to his office, eager to show him some of his projects. He wanted to share the part of himself he had always been so passionate about, architecture. As they walked through the office, James began talking about the designs, the buildings, and the challenges he faced during his early years. He was nervous at first, unsure of how Ethan would react, but soon he realized how much his son was paying attention. "Do you think you could design something like this?" James asked, pointing to a large blueprint spread out across the table. Ethan's eyes sparkled. "I think so," he said, his voice filled with enthusiasm. "I love the way you think about the space. It's like you're designing more than just a building, it's like you're designing the future." James was taken aback. In all the years of building his career, he had never had someone look at his work with such genuine interest, such raw curiosity. Ethan wasn't just impressed by the structures. He was impressed by the process, by the creative ideas that went into designing a space for people to live and work in. James could see the budding architect in his son, the same passion for design that he had felt at Ethan's age. For the first time, James felt a deep connection to the boy. It wasn't just about blood, about the fact that Ethan was his son. It was about the shared experience of creating something, of imagining a future together. James realized that he had a lot to offer Ethan, not just in terms of wealth or material things, but in terms of knowledge, of guidance, of being there for him. Later that day, they walked around the city, exploring some of James's past projects. They stood in front of a building James had designed years ago, its sleek lines and towering presence casting a shadow over the street. James explained the challenges he had faced when designing it, the obstacles that had seemed insurmountable at the time. "I remember when this was just an idea," James said, pointing to the building. "There were times when I thought I couldn't make it happen, but then one step at a time I pushed through, and now it's here." Ethan looked up at the building, his gaze thoughtful. "It's pretty cool," he said, "but how did you get it done?" "How did you not give up?" James smiled. It was a simple question, but one that carried so much weight. Because sometimes, he said, the hardest part isn't the work. It's believing in the vision, even when everyone around you doubts it. You have to keep going, even when you don't see the end of the road. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing his father's words. The simple exchange, this conversation, this moment, was something James had missed for so long. It wasn't about teaching Ethan to be successful, or to build a fortune, or to follow in his footsteps. It was about showing him that persistence, passion, and belief in oneself could overcome even the toughest challenges. James found himself thinking about his own journey, about the sacrifices he had made in the name of success. He had pushed away the people who mattered most, Olivia, and now Ethan, in his relentless pursuit of more. But standing here with his son, hearing him ask questions, seeing him think deeply about the world around him, James realized that it wasn't too late to change. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a father, and that came with its own set of responsibilities, its own rewards. As the afternoon wore on, James and Ethan continued their walk through the city. They talked about baseball, about school, about things James hadn't thought about in years. They were building a bridge, piece by piece, over the distance that had once seemed impossible to cross. James knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be times when the weight of the past, the mistakes, the regrets, would threaten to pull him back into old habits. But for the first time, he felt like he had a real chance to create something meaningful with his son. This wasn't about an empire or a business deal. This was about the fallout. As James adjusted to his new role as a father, the consequences of his decisions began to unfold in every area of his life. The wedding he had so meticulously planned was now off, and his relationship with Victoria had ended in a way that neither of them had expected. Despite the relief James felt in choosing to focus on his son, there was no denying that the fallout from canceling the wedding and choosing his family over his career would have lasting repercussions. Victoria wasted no time in leveraging her connections. Her father, who had played a significant role in James's rise to prominence, was furious about the wedding's cancellation. He wasn't just angry at James for canceling the event. He was livid that James had embarrassed their family and professional network. The prestige of the Prescott name was something Victoria had relied on, and now, James's decision was jeopardizing not only their wedding, but also the valuable business relationships that had helped him grow his empire. James spent long nights thinking about the impact of his decision. The phone calls from clients who were suddenly hesitant to work with him. The press coverage of his canceled wedding that painted him as a man caught between two worlds, the world of corporate success and the messy reality of personal responsibility. The media wasn't kind to him, but James was no longer concerned about public perception. What mattered now was rebuilding his relationship with Ethan and Olivia. Despite everything, Marcus, his longtime friend and business partner, had been the one voice of reason. He had remained by James's side throughout the chaos, even though he didn't completely understand the decision. James had spent decades building his business, and Marcus had always believed that the key to happiness was achieving success. But now he was seeing James in a new light. "I don't get it, man," Marcus said one evening as they sat in the office. "You're throwing away years of work, years of success. Victoria's family controls a massive portion of the real estate market, and you're walking away from all that." James leaned back in his chair, staring at the city skyline through the window. "I spent years chasing a version of success that wasn't real. I thought it was about buildings and profits, but now I realize it's about the people you build your life with. I wasn't there for Ethan, and I can't change that. But I can be there now." Marcus was silent for a long time, taking in James's words. "You know what? Maybe you're right. Maybe the game's changed for you, but don't expect me to clean up your mess. I'll be here, but the board isn't going to wait forever." James nodded, fully aware of the stakes. The board of directors at Whitmore Enterprises was growing impatient. They had already begun discussing a potential buyout of the company, a move that could break apart everything he had worked for. The Prescott family was pushing hard for the takeover, and the business world was starting to see cracks in the once immovable Whitmore empire. James's decision to prioritize family over business had come at a high price, and it was clear that the road ahead would not be easy. But in the midst of all this turmoil, James found himself reconnecting with Olivia and Ethan in ways he hadn't imagined possible. Every time he spent time with his son, every time they talked about school, baseball, or life in general, he felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. Ethan's enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time in a long time, James began to enjoy the simple moments that had nothing to do with money or success, but everything to do with the joy of being present. Olivia, too, was becoming more open to the idea of a partnership. She had always been wary of James's motivations, of his ability to prioritize anything other than his career. But now, seeing him spend time with Ethan, hearing him express regret over the years he had missed, Olivia started to see the man he had become. It wasn't about reliving the past or trying to fix everything that had gone wrong. It was about moving forward together as a family. The time James spent with Ethan, helping him with homework, going to his baseball games, and even showing him the basics of design and architecture, helped to build a bond that was slowly, but surely, taking root. Ethan, despite the awkwardness of their initial meetings, was beginning to open up to James in ways that made his heart swell with pride. The boy looked up to him not because he was famous or successful, but because he was trying to be a father, trying to make things right. And in those quiet moments with Ethan, James realized that his empire, his real estate ventures, his financial achievements, would never compare to the connection he was building with his son. This was what mattered. This was the legacy he wanted to leave behind. Not buildings, not wealth, but the love and guidance of a father who had finally understood the true meaning of success. But even as he reconnected with his son and started to rebuild his life, the outside world continued to push against him. Business was becoming more difficult. The Prescott family was using their influence to take control of Whitmore Enterprises, and rumors swirled that James's empire might crumble. The board of directors was already meeting with potential buyers, looking for ways to sell off the company's assets and move on. James's attention was divided between his personal life and the increasingly dire situation at work. Despite all of this, he remained focused on one thing: Ethan. James knew that if he was going to rebuild, he needed to take drastic action. He couldn't keep living in the past, relying on old patterns and relationships. He had to step back, reevaluate what mattered, and redefine his path forward. But even as the business world closed in on him, there was a new strength in James, a strength he hadn't known existed. His focus was now on what truly mattered, and that gave him the courage to take the necessary steps to ensure that he and Ethan could have a future together. A new perspective. As James continued to grapple with the fallout from his personal and professional life, he found that the only consistent source of peace was his time with Ethan. In a life that had once been ruled by board meetings and financial reports, the simplicity of sitting with his son and discussing everything from baseball stats to architectural designs brought a sense of calm James hadn't experienced in years. Every moment spent with Ethan was a reminder of what he had almost lost, and it pushed him to rethink his life, not just in terms of what he had built, but in terms of what truly mattered. He knew he had to make significant changes to both his business and his personal life. He couldn't keep prioritizing success if it meant sacrificing the relationships that gave his life meaning. The revelation was painful, but it was also liberating. It was as if he had been trapped in a maze, chasing after things that were never going to bring him happiness, and now he had finally found the exit. The first step James took was to significantly downsize his business. Whitmore Enterprises had been a symbol of his success, but it had become a heavy burden. The pressure to maintain the empire, to continue expanding and growing, was exhausting him. More importantly, it kept him from being there for Ethan. After much deliberation and a few sleepless nights, he made the difficult decision to step down from the daily operations of the company and shift his focus back to his original passion: design. He handed over the reins of the company to Marcus, promoting him to CEO, while he remained involved as the chairman, overseeing only the projects that truly mattered to him. The decision was met with skepticism from the board, who had always relied on James's hands-on approach. But James knew that he couldn't continue as the man he had been. He had to change, and he couldn't do that while still clinging to the corporate structure that had consumed him for so long. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus asked, concern evident in his voice. He had been James's right-hand man for years, and even though he understood the decision, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. "This is a huge shift. You're stepping away from everything we've worked for." James looked out the window, his eyes distant. "I spent years trying to build something that was never truly mine. Now I'm focusing on what's important: my family, my happiness. I have to let go of the need for constant growth, for more and more. It's never been about buildings for me, Marcus. It's about what those buildings represent, a life I can be proud of." Marcus nodded, even though he wasn't fully convinced. "Well, I support you, man, but you're going to have to take the heat for this. The board won't be happy." James understood the risks. Letting go of the daily operations of the company meant putting his financial legacy in someone else's hands. It meant less control, less power. But it also meant more time with Ethan, more time to build a relationship he had neglected for far too long. James found himself reconnecting with his original love for architecture, the very reason he had pursued a career in real estate in the first place. He began to visit his old projects, walking through the buildings he had designed, reflecting on the challenges he had faced. Each project brought back memories of the man he had been when he first started, passionate, driven, eager to create something lasting. But now there was a new sense of purpose. This was no longer about ego or status. It was about the work itself, about creating spaces that would help people live better lives. He started drawing again, not for clients or investors, but for himself. The sketches that once filled his mind with dreams of grandeur now served as a form of therapy, a way to reclaim a part of himself that he had lost in the pursuit of success. He found a sense of fulfillment in the simple act of creation, something he hadn't experienced in years. Meanwhile, Ethan was growing up fast, and James was there for it. Baseball season was in full swing, and James found himself at every game, cheering for Ethan from the stands. He had missed so many of these moments before, but now he was determined to make up for lost time. The bond between them was strengthening with each passing day. They talked about everything, from school projects to their shared interest in architecture. Ethan was growing more comfortable around his father, opening up in ways that James hadn't imagined possible. One evening, as they were sitting together in the living room after a game, Ethan turned to him, his voice hesitant. "Dad, do you think I could design buildings too?" James's heart swelled with pride. It wasn't the buildings that mattered, but the fact that Ethan was showing interest in something that had always been a part of James's life. "Of course you can," James replied. "You've got a good eye for it already. You've got the drive. If you want to design buildings, I'll help you." Ethan smiled, a sense of excitement lighting up his face. "Really? I want to design something huge, something like the skyscrapers you did." James chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "Let's start with something smaller first, maybe a treehouse. We'll build it together, okay?" Ethan laughed, a sound that filled the room with warmth. "Deal." In that moment, James realized that the future was no longer defined by what he had built for himself, but by what he could build with his son. The path forward wasn't about constructing monumental buildings or expanding his empire. It was about creating a future together, about finding joy in the little moments, and building a relationship that would last long after the projects and profits faded away. The change wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt, still challenges to face in both his personal and professional life. But for the first time in years, James felt a sense of peace. He had made the right choice, and the road ahead, though uncertain, was one he was ready to walk with Ethan by his side. The breaking point, despite his newfound clarity and the steps he had taken to reconnect with his family, James couldn't escape the lingering reality of his professional life. His decision to step away from the day-to-day operations of Whitmore Enterprises had not been an easy one, and the consequences were starting to manifest in ways he had not anticipated. The board had reacted poorly to his decision. They were used to James being the driving force behind every deal, every project. Now, with Marcus taking the reins as CEO and James more involved in his personal life than in his company, whispers began to spread. Some of the board members were pushing for a sale of Whitmore Enterprises, citing the growing uncertainty surrounding James's leadership. Investors, wary of the shift in direction, began pulling out. James knew that this was coming. His focus on his family had shifted the balance of power, and now the consequences of that decision were clear. It was a harsh reality to face, but it was also something he had prepared for. The future of the company and his legacy was uncertain. And yet, as he sat in his office, surrounded by the emptiness of what had once been his world, he felt an odd sense of relief. He had chosen to put his energy into something that was truly important. His time with Ethan had become the focal point of his life, and that gave him a sense of fulfillment he had never experienced before. Even as his empire crumbled, he felt a calmness he had never known, a feeling that his relationship with his son was worth more than any board meeting or business deal. But the business side of things was inescapable. Marcus called James one afternoon, the urgency in his voice unmistakable. "James, we need to talk. The board's ready to pull the trigger on a deal. They're talking to buyers. They want to sell, and they want it done quickly. If we don't act, we could lose everything." James's heart sank, but he remained calm. "Let me talk to them," he said, though he knew there wasn't much left to be said. The decision had been made long ago. His departure from the company's leadership had been the beginning of the end. That afternoon, James attended a meeting with the board. The room was tense, the members visibly frustrated. They had all invested years of their lives in building the company into a powerhouse, and now, in their eyes, it was slipping away due to James's personal choices. Their voices rose in frustration as they discussed the potential sale, outlining the impact it would have on their careers, their finances, and their futures. "We built this company together," one board member said, his tone bitter. "And now you're walking away from it. You're going to let it fall apart because you want to play house with your ex-wife and your son." James stood up, feeling the weight of the accusation. "I'm not walking away," he replied, his voice steady but firm. "I'm redefining what matters. This company and all of you have been my life for so long. But now I've realized that family comes first. I can't keep doing this, not at the cost of losing my son again." The room fell silent, the board members exchanging looks. James could feel the tension rising, the anger, the disbelief. They had built this empire together, but it had always been his vision that had driven it forward. Without him at the helm, they were lost. "I'll fight for the company, but it's not the same fight I was fighting before," James continued. "It's about finding balance. It's about creating something that lasts, not just for me, but for the people who rely on this company to support their families. I'm not going to let Whitmore Enterprises fall apart, but I'm not going to sacrifice what's most important to me either." The meeting ended in a tense silence. James had made his decision, but the board was still reeling from the shift in direction. He knew it wouldn't be easy to repair the damage, but he also knew that he couldn't go back to the way things had been. The old James, the one obsessed with success, with wealth, with power, no longer existed. He had changed, and if the company couldn't survive the change, then so be it. That night after the meeting, James found himself alone in his office. The city lights outside the window flickered like a distant dream. He sat in the dark, reflecting on the path that had led him here. He thought about the choices he had made, the sacrifices he had made, and the relationships he had neglected. But he also thought about Ethan, about the connection they had built, about the father he had become. The phone rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Olivia. "James, we need to talk," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "I'm listening," James replied, feeling the weight of her words. "I've been thinking," Olivia continued, "about everything that's happened. About you stepping away from the company, about the wedding, about Ethan. And I've come to a decision." James's heart raced. "What decision?" "I think it's time we talked about what comes next," Olivia said. "Not just for Ethan, but for us." James felt a sudden rush of emotion. It wasn't just about Ethan anymore, it was about them too. Maybe there was a chance for them to rebuild, to find a new beginning, not as a couple, but as co-parents, as partners in creating a life for Ethan. "Let's meet tomorrow," James said, his voice tight with anticipation. "We'll talk." The next day, James and Olivia met at a cafe, away from the pressure of the city and the weight of their past. They talked for hours about the future, about their dreams for Ethan, and about the possibility of starting over together. It wasn't about rekindling their romance. It was about building a partnership based on mutual respect, shared goals, and love for their son. As they parted that afternoon, James felt a renewed sense of hope. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. He had reached his breaking point, but in doing so, he had discovered a new strength, one that came from facing the truth, from letting go of the past, and from choosing to build something real with the people who mattered most. Reconnecting with the past, as the weeks went by, James found himself diving deeper into the challenges of rebuilding not only his business, but also his personal life. The decision to step back from the company and redefine his priorities was still fresh, and while the weight of that choice lingered, there was a sense of clarity he hadn't had before. It wasn't just about Ethan and Olivia, though those were undeniably the focal points of his new life. It was also about reconnecting with the person he used to be, the young architect who had once dreamed of creating meaningful spaces for people to live, work, and thrive. Despite the challenges at Whitmore Enterprises, James found solace in the act of designing again. He spent his days sketching plans for smaller, more personal projects. He wasn't trying to create the towering skyscrapers that had once filled his dreams. Instead, he was designing homes, schools, and community spaces, places that could make a real difference in people's lives. His focus had shifted from building monuments to himself to creating things that mattered on a more human level. But it wasn't just in his work that James sought to reconnect with the past. He also sought to rebuild his relationship with Olivia. Their partnership as parents had always been solid, but they had spent so many years apart, both emotionally and physically, that it was as if they had lost the connection they once shared. There was still a sense of mutual respect between them, but James had come to realize that they needed more than just that. They needed to be able to talk, to understand each other's perspectives, and to move forward in a way that wasn't just for Ethan's benefit, but for their own. One Saturday afternoon, James and Olivia took Ethan to the park. It was a simple outing, nothing extravagant, but it felt meaningful in its simplicity. They walked side by side, enjoying the small moments of togetherness. For the first time in a long while, James felt a sense of peace. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, wasn't concerned about the pressures of the business world. He was just with his son, with Olivia, building new memories that were grounded in the present, not the past. Ethan was growing quickly, and James could see how much his son had matured in just a few short months. His once hesitant attitude toward James had softened into something more comfortable. Ethan was beginning to trust him, to look to him as a father, and James was doing his best to be worthy of that trust. He still had a long way to go, but every step forward was a victory. During a break in their walk, they sat down on a bench, watching as Ethan kicked a soccer ball around with some other kids. James and Olivia talked about the future, not just about Ethan's future, but their own as well. They discussed the possibility of creating a family routine, something that would allow them to share in the everyday joys of parenting. James was no longer the man who saw his work as his entire life. He knew now that his true success would be measured by the relationship he could build with his son, not the skyscrapers he had once aspired to create. "I'm glad we're doing this," Olivia said, her voice softer than it had been in years. "It's been a long time since we've spent time like this as a family." James smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Me too," he said. "It feels right." Olivia looked at him, her gaze thoughtful. "I know this hasn't been easy," she said, "for either of us, but I'm glad you're here. I'm glad Ethan has you in his life." James nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I missed so much," he admitted. "I can't change the past, but I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." The conversation shifted as they watched Ethan laugh and play with his new friends, and James felt a sense of hope that he hadn't known in years. There was no guarantee of a perfect future. There would still be challenges ahead in both his personal life and his business life. But for the first time, James was facing those challenges with a clear sense of purpose. He wasn't trying to have it all. He wasn't trying to be perfect. He was just trying to be the best father he could be. Later that evening, after a quiet dinner with Olivia and Ethan, James reflected on the changes he had made. His life was no longer about conquering the world. It was about building a life that was worth living. And as he looked at Ethan, he realized that the true legacy he would leave behind wouldn't be written in contracts or buildings. It would be written in the moments he shared with his son, in the lessons he taught him, and in the love they built together. The following week, James made another decision that would shape his future. He decided to sell off several of the properties that had once been the cornerstone of his wealth. The sale wouldn't just provide the financial cushion he needed to move forward, but it would also allow him to focus on what mattered most. It was a symbolic step, a way of saying goodbye to the old James and embracing the new one, the man who was ready to be a father, to rebuild his relationship with Olivia, and to design a future based on love and connection rather than profit and ambition. It wasn't easy, but it felt right. James knew that he would always have the drive to succeed, but now he understood that success wasn't just about money or power. It was about creating a life that was meaningful, that mattered, and that would leave a lasting impact on those he loved. A new beginning. James had spent the last few months in what felt like a whirlwind of change. Every decision he made, from stepping away from the day-to-day operations of Whitmore Enterprises to reconnecting with Ethan and Olivia, had been a step toward a new life, one that wasn't defined by buildings or business deals, but by family, love, and authenticity. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to embrace whatever came next. The sale of several of Whitmore Enterprises' properties marked a major milestone in James's transition. While the move wasn't universally praised, it was a necessary step. It provided him the financial freedom to focus on what really mattered, his family. It also freed him from the weight of maintaining a sprawling empire that had long since outgrown the personal values he now wanted to prioritize. James didn't need to be the richest man in the room anymore. He didn't need to impress anyone. What mattered was being the best father he could be for Ethan, the best co-parent he could be for Olivia, and the best version of himself he could become. As he walked away from the old version of himself, the one obsessed with achievement and status, he felt a sense of lightness that he hadn't felt in years. The evening after the sale was finalized, James sat down at the dining table with Ethan and Olivia. They were having a quiet meal together, a simple pasta dish that Ethan had helped prepare. It wasn't fancy, but the atmosphere was warm, the conversation light. They were talking about Ethan's upcoming summer plans, the possibility of a family vacation, and the projects James had been sketching. "You know, Dad," Ethan said, pushing his plate aside, "I think I want to do more than just design buildings. I want to make a difference. I want to design places where people can come together, where they can learn, where they can grow." James was taken aback by his son's words. Ethan had always been interested in architecture, but hearing him express the desire to create spaces with purpose, spaces that impacted people's lives in a positive way, filled James with pride. It was clear that Ethan was beginning to see the bigger picture. He wasn't just interested in designing impressive structures. He wanted to design a future where people thrived. "You've got a good heart, kid," James said, his voice filled with warmth. "And that's the kind of thing that will make you successful. Not just the buildings you create, but the way you make people feel when they walk into those spaces." Ethan smiled, his eyes lighting up. "Thanks, Dad. I'm excited to see what we can create together." In that moment, James realized that his journey was no longer about achieving success for himself. It was about creating a legacy with his son, a legacy that would last far longer than any building or skyscraper he had designed. The foundation they were building together, one based on shared experiences, love, and understanding, was something far more meaningful than any tangible success he had once chased. As for Olivia, their relationship had grown stronger, not in the romantic sense, but in a way that was more mature and grounded. They had learned to communicate better, to listen to each other's needs and desires. James knew that they could never go back to the past, but the future was open to possibilities. They had both changed, grown, and found a way to co-parent in a way that benefited Ethan. "You know," Olivia said one evening as they sat together after Ethan had gone to bed, "I never thought I'd see the day when we'd be sitting here like this. Together, as a family, not in the way we used to be, but in a new way." James nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Neither did I," he admitted, "but I think we've both come a long way." Olivia smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "We have, and I'm glad we're doing this, for Ethan, for us." As James sat with Olivia, reflecting on how far they had come, he couldn't help but feel grateful. He had once thought that success meant accumulating wealth, achieving recognition, and building a name for himself. But now he saw that real success was about the connections you made, the relationships you nurtured, and the love you gave and received. Those were the things that truly mattered. It wasn't just about what he could leave behind in terms of buildings or material wealth. It was about the people he loved, the memories they created, and the legacy they would leave as a family. In the months that followed, James continued to work on small-scale architectural projects, finding fulfillment in designs that prioritized functionality, sustainability, and community. He began consulting on projects that focused on creating spaces that helped people, whether through public schools, community centers, or affordable housing. Each project became a new opportunity to leave a mark on the world in a way that was meaningful to him. Ethan, too, began to explore his own designs. James saw a reflection of his younger self in his son's passion for architecture. They worked together on small projects, with James mentoring Ethan and guiding him through the design process. They built their first treehouse together, and it was a simple structure, nothing extravagant. But it was theirs. It was a project they both poured their hearts into, and it symbolized the new beginning they were sharing. As the summer came to a close, James and Olivia discussed the possibility of taking a family vacation. It was something they had never done as a family before, but now, with the bond between them growing stronger, it felt like the right time. They decided to take a road trip across the country, visiting national parks, small towns, and places they had always wanted to see. It wasn't about luxury or status. It was about spending time together, experiencing life as a family, and creating new memories. "I think this is the start of something good," James said as they planned the trip, his voice filled with optimism. Olivia smiled at him, her eyes filled with understanding. It is, she said. It's a new chapter for all of us. James couldn't help but agree. It wasn't the life he had imagined when he was younger, but it was the life he had created with Ethan and Olivia. And it was everything he needed. As they hit the road, driving through small towns and wide-open spaces, James felt a deep sense of peace. He wasn't chasing success anymore. A stronger future. As the road trip continued, James found himself reflecting on the evolution of his life, of how far he had come and how much more there was still to discover. The trip across the country was everything he had hoped for, a chance to bond with Ethan, to reconnect with Olivia, and to experience the simple joys of life that had eluded him for so long. Each stop brought a new sense of adventure, a new memory that they could all cherish. It was an experience that allowed them to slow down, to focus on one another, and to embrace the present moment rather than worrying about the next milestone or achievement. They visited national parks, hiked through forests, and explored the beauty of the outdoors. Ethan loved every second of it. His curiosity grew with every new place they visited, whether it was the Grand Canyon, the sweeping vistas of Yellowstone, or the quiet calm of the redwood forest. James couldn't help but be amazed at how quickly his son had grown. The boy was no longer the shy, hesitant child who had first met him. He was becoming someone who was eager to learn, eager to take on the world in his own way. James and Olivia had plenty of time to talk during the drive. Their conversations, once strained, had become more natural, more open. They had learned to listen to each other again, to support each other in ways that they hadn't in the past. Olivia had been the rock for so many years, raising Ethan on her own, and James had been blind to the sacrifices she had made. Now he was learning to appreciate her in a deeper way, not just as Ethan's mother, but as a person who had built a life for herself, despite all the challenges she had faced. One evening, as they sat around a campfire at a campsite in the mountains, James found himself thinking about how different this moment was compared to the life he had once known. There was no luxury here, no business meetings or social obligations to attend. Just the sound of the fire crackling, the stars overhead, and the warmth of his family beside him. "I can't believe we never did this before," Olivia said, looking around at the campfire. "This is the kind of life I always dreamed of, just being here with you and Ethan." James nodded, a sense of peace settling in his chest. "I know. I didn't realize how much I was missing until now. This, right here, is what matters. The trip wasn't just about physical distance. It was also about emotional distance from the pressures of their former lives. Each mile they drove took them further from the business world that had once consumed James's every thought. They were in a different world now, one where the things that had once seemed important, wealth, power, and success, no longer held the same meaning. They reached the final leg of their journey in a small coastal town. The ocean stretched out before them, the waves crashing gently against the shore. It was here, at the edge of the world, that James felt a deep sense of renewal. Standing on the beach with Olivia and Ethan, he knew that this was where he wanted to be, not in a high-rise office or at the top of a corporate ladder, but here, with his family. He wanted to help shape their future, not by building monuments, but by creating a life that was built on love, respect, and shared experiences. Ethan was already running toward the water, laughing as he splashed in the surf. James smiled, feeling his heart swell with pride. This was the son he had missed for so many years. This was the relationship he was going to nurture, protect, and grow, and it wasn't just about being there physically. It was about being present emotionally, about truly listening to Ethan, about showing him that he was there for him, not just as a father, but as a partner in his life journey. Later that evening, after a dinner of fresh seafood at a local restaurant, James sat down with Olivia. The weight of their conversation was heavy, but it felt right. They talked about the future, about how they wanted to approach the next chapter of their lives. They weren't sure where the road would lead, but they knew they wanted to take it together as a family. "Do you think we'll be okay?" Olivia asked, her voice quieter than usual. James looked at her, his eyes filled with certainty. "Yes. We've already made it through the hardest part. We'll figure it out." It was a simple response, but it encapsulated everything they had worked for: understanding, trust, and the willingness to face the unknown together. As the night drew to a close, James took a deep breath, feeling a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. He had made peace with his past, with his mistakes, and now he was ready for whatever the future held. The future wasn't about rebuilding an empire or chasing status. It was about building something real with the people he loved, something that would last far beyond his career or his financial achievements. It was about being present, being a father, and being part of a family that mattered. The next morning, as they packed up to head back home, James felt a quiet sense of excitement. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew it would be full of possibilities. Whatever happened with Whitmore Enterprises, whatever challenges came their way, James was confident that he and his family could handle it together. As they drove back toward home, the landscape passing by in a blur, James looked at Ethan in the rearview mirror, smiling. His son was growing up so fast, but in that moment he felt like the luckiest man in the world. He had everything he needed: his son, his family, and the future ahead of them. And that, he realized, was the greatest success of all. The road ahead. As the months passed after their road trip, life for James, Olivia, and Ethan began to settle into a new routine. The whirlwind of changes James had undergone was still fresh, but there was a sense of stability that had started to take root. James was no longer the workaholic he had once been, constantly preoccupied with business dealings, financial success, and building a name for himself. Instead, he found fulfillment in spending time with his family, nurturing his relationship with Ethan, and continuing to work on architectural projects that reflected his newfound values. Whitmore Enterprises was no longer the centerpiece of his life, and although there were still occasional phone calls from the board or investors, James had learned to prioritize what mattered most. He wasn't willing to sacrifice his time with Ethan just to secure the company's future. Marcus, as CEO, had taken over the reins of the company, and while James remained chairman, he was no longer in the trenches, fighting for every deal and every dollar. Instead, he was focusing on his personal life, on the experiences he was creating with Ethan, and on rediscovering his passion for design. In the evenings, James often found himself sketching new ideas, not for towering skyscrapers or luxury condos, but for community centers, affordable housing, and family-oriented spaces. He worked on projects that would help others, spaces where people could grow, learn, and thrive. It was a different kind of challenge, one that made him feel more connected to his work than ever before. But it wasn't just his work that was transforming. His relationship with Olivia had evolved as well. What had once been strained, built on years of unresolved tension and unspoken frustrations, had become something stronger and more genuine. They were learning to communicate more openly, to respect each other's boundaries, and to work together as co-parents. The love that had once been lost had found its way back, not in the form of romantic reconciliation, but in the form of mutual understanding and support. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of tension, especially when it came to navigating the complexities of raising Ethan together. But there was no longer any doubt in James's mind that they were both committed to making it work. They were partners in their son's life, and that was enough. One weekend, as the family gathered for a small gathering at their house, James and Olivia had an honest conversation about their future. They talked about what they both wanted for themselves, for Ethan, and for their family. James listened to Olivia's dreams, her goals, and her vision for the future, and for the first time in years, he truly understood her. She had always been the rock, the one who held everything together, and now they were learning to build a future together, one that was less about personal ambition and more about shared happiness. "I think we've both learned a lot in the past year," Olivia said, sipping her coffee. "About ourselves, about each other, and about what really matters." James nodded, smiling at her. "I agree. I think we've come a long way." "I'm proud of you," Olivia added, her voice soft. "Not just for everything you've accomplished, but for the person you're becoming." James's heart swelled at her words. It wasn't just about the achievements, the success, or the empire he had built. It was about being a better person, a better father, and a better partner. He had spent so many years chasing after the wrong things, but now he was finally on the right path. And it wasn't just Olivia who had noticed the change. Ethan had too. The boy who had once been hesitant and unsure around his father had blossomed into someone confident, trusting, and eager to learn. He was excelling in school, making friends, and even showing a growing interest in architecture, something that James could not have been more proud of. "Hey, Dad," Ethan said one evening after dinner, his voice filled with excitement. "I've been thinking about some ideas for the community center we're working on. Do you think we could add some more green spaces for kids to play in? Maybe some areas for art, too?" James looked at his son, impressed by his thoughtfulness. "I love that idea, Ethan. You're thinking about the people who will use the space, and that's exactly what this project is all about." Ethan smiled, his eyes lighting up. "I want to make sure it's a place that everyone can enjoy, a place where they feel at home. James's heart swelled with pride. It wasn't just about the physical space they were designing together. It was about Ethan's mindset, the way he was beginning to understand the impact they could have on the world around them. A legacy reimagined. The years that followed were transformative for James, his family, and the company he had once built. As the dust settled from his departure from the day-to-day operations of Whitmore Enterprises, James slowly but surely realized that the decision to walk away from the pursuit of profit and success had been the best decision he could have made for himself. The transformation was no longer just about leaving behind a business empire. It was about embracing a new way of life, one where family, personal growth, and impact on the community came first. The family, together with James, had built something that was truly meaningful, not just in the physical sense, but emotionally. The road trip, the countless hours spent together as a family, and their work on small community projects had brought them closer than ever. The challenges James had faced in the past, the pressures of corporate success, the blind pursuit of recognition, and the mistakes that had cost him so much, seemed distant now. The new James wasn't chasing after power anymore. He wasn't trying to be a business mogul or someone who could impress others with his wealth. Instead, he was someone who sought purpose in the smallest of moments. Ethan, now a young teenager, had taken a keen interest in design, architecture, and most importantly, community work. The ideas James had shared with him about creating spaces that positively impacted people's lives had taken root in Ethan's heart. He was determined to study architecture with a focus on social impact, a vision that James fully supported. By this time, James had launched a new design firm, focusing on projects that prioritized sustainable, community-driven architecture. It wasn't about flashy designs or expensive materials. It was about creating spaces that fostered a sense of connection, purpose, and inclusivity. The firm's first few projects were modest, but they made a significant impact on the communities they served. One such project was a community center for a neighborhood in need. The space included areas for art classes, after-school programs for children, and meeting spaces for local organizations. The design was simple yet effective: bright colors, open spaces, and a strong emphasis on green areas where kids could play and learn. This wasn't a high-end development or an investment opportunity. It was a place where people could come together, learn, and grow. James, working alongside Ethan, saw the joy and satisfaction that came from creating something that would last beyond them, something that would serve the community for years to come. They worked together on the design, with Ethan coming up with ideas for interactive spaces where kids could express themselves. It was a collaborative process, one that mirrored their growing bond. "Do you think we did a good job?" Ethan asked one day, looking at the final plans for the community center. James looked at his son, his heart full of pride. "I think we did more than a good job. I think we created something that will make a difference in people's lives. And that's what matters most." Ethan smiled, his eyes filled with hope. "I want to keep doing this, creating spaces like this. Spaces that matter." James nodded. "I think you found your path, and I'm here to help you every step of the way." The business world continued to evolve, but James no longer felt the pull to chase after wealth or accolades. The real reward for him was seeing Ethan grow into a young man with values rooted in compassion, kindness, and the desire to help others. It was seeing their work come to life in ways that impacted real people. It was knowing that the legacy James was leaving behind wasn't one defined by material wealth, but by the positive changes he had made in the lives of the people around him. Olivia continued to be an integral part of the process. She had always been the steady hand, the one who grounded their family when things seemed chaotic. As a co-parent, she had been unwavering in her support of James's transition, and the two of them had developed a co-parenting dynamic that allowed them to focus on what was best for Ethan. As the years went on, they also found a friendship that was rooted in mutual respect and understanding. They no longer needed to hold on to the past to move forward. Instead, they had created a future together, one that was based on shared responsibility for their son and a deeper, more meaningful connection. In their quiet moments, James and Olivia would often reflect on the journey they had been on together. It wasn't the journey they had once planned, but it was the journey they had found together, with its ups and downs, its challenges and triumphs. The connection they had built wasn't defined by the mistakes of the past, but by the decisions they had made to become better versions of themselves. As Ethan prepared to leave for college, James couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and sadness. His son was ready to take the next step in his journey, one that would likely lead him to places James could only dream of. Yet, despite the bittersweet feeling of watching his son grow up, James knew that their bond would remain strong, no matter the physical distance. "You're going to do great things, Ethan," James said, standing in the doorway of his son's room. Ethan turned and smiled. "Thanks, Dad, I'm going to make you proud." "You already do," James replied, his voice thick with emotion, "just by being who you are." As Ethan left for college, James stood there for a moment, reflecting on everything he had learned. He had spent so many years chasing after the wrong things, but in the end, it was the simple moments, the quiet conversations, the shared experiences, the act of creation that had given him the most fulfillment. He didn't need to be a billionaire to feel successful. He didn't need to be the leader of a massive corporation. He just needed to be present, to give love, and to make a difference. As James watched his son drive off into the future, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. He had built something far greater than an empire of wealth and power.